without children, things feel kind of hollow, especially Christmas. And she likes Christmas. She likes putting up the tree and decorating it and doing all the rituals like that. But over the years, we got a bit lazier and lazier. And I find that once you have young people involved, all of a sudden everything gets some of that magic back. And what's interesting for you, I think, is that's really the opportunity to start installing literally whatever tradition you want and just, and then it'll be normal for them, and then they'll start to ask for it. So if dad has all this kind of Yule stuff, kind of, that will become the new thing, and then spread to all the neighborhood kids.
That's definitely true with my friend the Fergan.
Oh yeah, him. How's he doing?
Oh yeah, he's great. Like I'd say a way that he's done. He's essentially raised his children in a very heathen household, and for them that's just the standard way of doing things. So it's very good that rather than having someone like that feeling forced and artificial or reconstructed in some way, it's something that they've been born into naturally from a very young age and just feels entirely normal to them.
Well, let me ask you this also, and this will be, you have to count me as ignorant on a lot of this stuff. Would heathen be an acceptable term as well as pagan? Are they the same, or how would those split?
I'd say that the words are pretty much interchangeable, but I use heathen specifically to refer to the sort of Germanic branch of paganism as opposed to people practicing Roman paganism, Greek paganism. If someone wanted to revive Egyptian paganism, who lived in Egypt, not that they would, given that it's a very strict Muslim country there. And also, as I said, at the Coptic Church as well, but I can't see anyone reviving Egyptian polytheism seriously anytime soon. But if they wanted to, they could. But it's like, even Japanese Shintoism, that's technically a form of paganism. The traditional religion by the South Americans and Native Americans, that's technically a form of paganism. It's any form of natural religion rather than a revealed religion that's given at some point in time and dictated by scripture. It's more the natural tribal traditions of a people that seems to emerge a lot more. I'd say more bottom up rather than a top down thing. It's something that's very connected to a people, their land, their landscape, and their blood and their sense of identity. It's a lot more emergent.
Well, that's interesting because I think you had mentioned Japan, and it's funny because I was just playing this game recently called Ghostwire Tokyo, and it's about hunting down ghosts essentially, but it has all these appeals to different what I assume to be Japanese sort of pagan beliefs, and I would argue that. Like for me as an outsider looking in Japan, I see a lot of like element employment. I see a lot of more worship of the land, the nature, and these sort of folk spirits that still have a place within that society and culture. And perhaps I'm not any expert on Asian identity at all, really, but I think you would see the same thing in China. Is that something you see, sort of like a modern thriving of paganism in certain parts of the world versus others?
Since technically paganism never really died out, even the last place to convert to Christianity was the Baltic areas of Latvia and Lithuania, and even that was that continued into the 18th century, and a lot of paganism still survived in various small pockets, small areas, and even seemed to work its way into folklore rather than being the dominant religion. It's always had that sort of continuation that never really died out. It just didn't become the main state mandated religion. But it's always been there in a lot of Asia. A lot of since both China and Japan seemed to shake off a lot of their Christianity. It was forced out by Japan during the Middle Ages as well. But in China, they've had a very on-off relationship with with Abrahamic religion. They've adopted Christianity in various forms, but it still hasn't become the dominant religion. But I can't say whether that's because of their adoption of communism in recent times.
Well, that's interesting. Do you think that because famously the communists and the Marxists were always against Christianity, they're against a lot of religion in general. But I haven't heard much about communist opposition to paganism, but I would assume it's there. Do you think, have you heard of Marxists taking an aggressive tone against that stuff?
I'd say definitely. I think that historically, it probably wasn't treated as a threat, or honestly a serious threat at all, because it had already been historically dissolved by Christianity anyway. But I think that the Marxist opposition to racial identity and national identity comes hand in hand with its opposition to paganism, since paganism is by its own nature very particularist and very focused. It's also quite racially exclusionary, and that is doesn't fit very well with communism at all.
Let me ask you this, and the reason I'll lead with is first, I'll introduce you also, by the way. I am here with a good friend of mine named Hwitgeard. Now, is that the right pronunciation? Because I typically get this stuff wrong.
Well, the G is pronounced softer, like an English Y, so it's Hwitgeard, and essentially it's the Old English for white.
Ah, okay. Thank you for.
Sorry, Hwitgeard is the Old English for white yard, essentially an enclosure or space for white ideas.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating. And you are on Telegram. That's where I know you from. But do you have any other channels? And you can find him on Telegram. His channel, he speaks a lot about what we're going to speak about today. But aside from your Telegram channel, do you have any other platforms or works that you would like to call attention to?
Yes, I'm on Odyssey and I'm on Substack, and I'm still composing various essays to put up on Substack, which haven't been published yet. And on Odyssey, I've currently republished videos that I've done for various live streams with people. That includes live streams with people like the Fergan, with Pox Populi, with Nick Stilby on the Writer's Block. And I've done a talk with Academic Agent and Charlemagne once as well.
I was about to say before I forget, you are frequently on the writer's block with Nick Gilvey, and you talk about very much the same thing. You are I've seen you build as an Anglo Saxon expert. Would that be fair to say?
I guess one could say that, yeah. I do have a deep interest in Anglo Saxon history and especially in the language as well. And it's also because of that, that seems to really inform the particular uniqueness of how I approach Germanic paganism or Germanic heathenry, um, specifically the Anglo-Saxon side of it, rather than the Nordic side of it, but which Vikings once practiced. But there's something very particular about the Anglo-Saxon uh, paganism, which seems to colour my own attitude towards my own nation in England and the landscape itself.
Well, that's fascinating because I think when a lot of people, perhaps myself included, when we think of this stuff, when we think of Germanic and versus Viking versus Anglo-Saxon, like it all seems to have one broad brush. And I would love it if you could speak, for example, like you just said, what about it speaks to you specifically and your attitudes versus perhaps some other types of paganism?
Well, it's essentially it's the native religion of this land and my ancestors. So I consider it something that speaks to me and calls to my blood. Um, but so far as the the differences between different forms of paganism, I think a very good metaphor to explain it, and also how different it would be to religions like Christianity or Islam or Judaism, is if you imagine the ultimate spiritual reality And rather than seeing that ultimate spiritual reality as equivalent to God, it's almost like it steps things back as a step. So we believe that our gods and other spiritual and sacred entities are they emerge from this ultimate spiritual reality. So God, well, the gods emanate from that spiritual reality. So they aren't equivalent to it, but they are a part of it, almost like different. In fact, I think that Colin Cleary, who's a author for Countercurrents, um, he explains this way of seeing paganism as being um, aspects of reality or fragments of reality, as if there's these different fragments, these different aspects of an underlying truth behind it all. So with that, it seems to allow for both a universal basis behind it, but to allow for different particularities in how it's expressed, how it's worshipped, how it's understood by different peoples. So there's no contradiction between Anglo Saxon paganism, between Norse paganism, between Roman paganism, between Aztec paganism, between Japanese paganism, their Shintoism, it, uh, and of Indian Hinduism. While they have various similarities to each other, they're all separate aspects of a common underlying spiritual truth. And in that way, there's no contradiction between them. There's no conflict of interest. There's no that believing one is exclusive to the other. So I choose to believe in the Anglo-Saxon approach to it because it's the one that connects to my blood, to my race, and my homeland.
That's a fascinating way of putting it. And I have one question here, and this is kind of an odd question, but I know, especially in for example, the Christian scene, there's some people who are attracted to it, and this is something that gets talked about all the time. Sometimes for the wrong reasons, or some people are looking for Christianity to fulfill some sort of political hole that they have in their heart, which is what they typically argue against. But I was wondering, is there something similar in the pagan scene? By which I mean, do you think there's a wrong way to get into it, or have you seen people get into this sort of belief system with the wrong ideas, or the wrong expectations?
Um, I can definitely see that. I think, but um, unfortunately, a lot of people, a lot of liberals and leftists do get into paganism because they just don't like Christianity. It becomes some sort of it's like them being angry at their parents. It's a way for them to rebel, and they get to choose the alternative or choose something that's against the mainstream. So as far as they're concerned, it's something subversive or alternative to the dominant culture. So a lot of them turn to it just out of disliking Christianity. But I think that there's a definite um, less saying that paganism is a very right wing thing, rather that it's something that is deeply invested in a much more traditional outlook in the world, and as far as I'd explain it as well, being very biopolitical. There's a very biopolitical basis that underlies paganism that those who practiced it thousands of years ago wouldn't have even had to question. It would have been part of how they see the world and how they feel the world. Whereas now you have people who that they seem to normalize things like homosexuality. They seem to praise immorality. They seem to believe that people can change sex at will, or they believe that that all races are the same and can coexist. And this sort of attitude would have been completely anathema to pagans of the past, because they had a very naturalist, a very biocentric attitude towards the world. They wouldn't have even thought twice about whether they had a duty to reproduce and raise strong, powerful families.
Well, that's very interesting because when a lot of people think about paganism, because my experience with paganism has been primarily through the right wing scene. We call it like broadly the dissident right. But the other day I was kind of whenever you plug back in the real world, you realize that paganism in the mainstream has been co-opted by hippies and new age types, I guess, and I guess this is what we'll get into in a second. I was going to ask you about witchcraft and shit, but so I think for a lot of people, they would side by side stack paganism with hedonism, and you're saying that was not always the case, or it was never the case, and it was, what they would call traditionalists. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. There's nothing hedonistic about that. Hedonism is a response to the luxuries of the modern world, the consumerism and sort of the luxuries that the modern world provides. And that's not the attitude that those who struggle to survive, to feed their family, who fought in various battles, even against their own brothers, just to build their settlements and put food on the table. There's a very traditional and a very authentic and grounded attitude that paganism had, not only because of its historical basis of when it was practiced in the past, but also because of its moral outlook as well. And it does have a very traditional moral framework.
That's very interesting. And you're going to have to get ready for a lot of dumb questions from me. One of the reasons is I want to sweep up some of the cobwebs around this topic that some people might not have thought of. And I guess the next thing I was going to ask was, and again, this is probably going to sound way off, but a lot of people, when they think about this sort of thing, would also bunch in witchcraft with that. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are, on Wicca or Wiccan. Does that kind of go with it, or is that seen as this other thing, or maybe even more of a modern thing? What do you think?
I'd say it's definitely a modern thing, but at the same time, there were contemporary terms for witches in the early medieval period, and on the one hand, you had various terms that were used for um, particularly women who had skills such as being able to divinate the future, being able to read particular signs that could be used for divination, but also that a lot of particular skills and practices which were spiritually involved in rituals. And these things could be called witchcraft by the Christian framework, which is where everything that isn't under Christianity would be considered witchcraft. And even a lot of traditional medicine um, would have become treated as witchcraft in the Middle Ages as well. But at the same time, the modern attitude of calling things witch.
Oh, sorry. I think there might be a bit of lag here. I apologize if it sounds like I'm interrupting you. I'm going to correct that later. But I was also going to say it strikes me that witchcraft, in some interpretations, could also be anti traditional as well, if it is a woman taking control or behaving in a way that would be anti community or anti family. And again, that might be a modern interpretation of what the role the witch had, but maybe that could be part of it too.
Well, especially in the northern Germanic peoples, which I'd call heathenism in this sense, just to differentiate it from other forms of paganism. Um, I'd say that women in these societies were certainly not equal to men, but they had a very particular and important social role, which which didn't see them in the same submissive a submissive social position that's dictated by the recommendations of St. Paul. He tends to give a lot of advice in Acts and in the and in his various letters for how women should be treated, how they should behave, and how they should dress. And if you read the works of people like Tacitus, for example, he's the earliest historian we have for the early Germanic peoples. And he seems to present the women as having a lot more clout, a lot more social respect in their societies. And as I said, not treated as equals in the same way, but definitely having a lot more role, especially in agriculture, especially in religious matters. And they had a very important position that shouldn't be downplayed in the same way. And I think this sort of position can be misinterpreted and seen as some sort of licentious proto feminism or something like that.
I'd heard people before, mainly Reddit types, say, come with their factoids saying that, oh, did you know that the Vikings were feminist? Things like that. I never believed it, but I am interested in if you had anything more about the role of women in these societies, because I don't think that really gets talked about a lot. And I'm interested in seeing how even the role of modern women might come more from specific religious influence. Did you have any other thoughts on the woman question?
Well, as I said, but they have a lot of important roles within the economy, which is often involves weaving, involves crafting, involves agriculture, and a lot of these every sort of work formed the basis of early medieval societies. It was obviously pre-industrial, but this sort of basis. Even the word economy comes from Greek oikonomos, where oikos means the house, and a lot of the roles of labour were very household based. So a lot of the work which would generate the economy came from housework, which would be things like weaving and building, and a lot of these things would be woman's work as well. But as well as the role in working in yeah, as well as the role of working that women were involved in. Um, while men were obviously involved in a lot of the more physical work and obviously involved in warfare and things like that. Um, Women weren't treated as inferior, but they had a much more particular and specific function rather than just being seen as an inferior man. And in the religious side of things, like one of the there's various words which is used for like witchcraft and things like that. But one of the words applied to women in Norse is Saith Konar, where Kona means woman. It's cognate with English queen. And Saither is a form of magic. And there's a particular unique form of magic that only women could practice. This is because this kind of magic seemed to reflect the role of weaving, especially in the way that the Germanic people see their fate or their word as being something that's woven um, like a tapestry, and those who could divinate and read these threads of word, and um, and therefore use that to see how events would unfold. It's like being able to read the strands of weaving, and because weaving was a woman's work in this case, this particular kind of magic, which would involve being able to divinate the strands of fate, was deemed as a very specifically woman kind of magic.
Well, that's fascinating. So, in a sense, and I know you've mentioned words quite a bit. It sounds to me that words really sit right at the center of this belief system. But would words and language be something uniquely tended to by women, or would women almost safeguard the language, or are they involved in the language in a more supernatural way, or am I just rambling?
Oh, by word, I don't mean WORD. It's WYRD, which is where we get the word weird from. Um, that's because of Shakespeare and the whole weird sisters that he had in Macbeth. But originally, the word weird referred to fate. So something that was weird is something that concerned fate or the threads of weird. Um, but weird, WYRD, is the word we use to denote the threads of fate. And in a Germanic myth, this is interpreted as being these threads are spun by these three ladies called the Norns, and um, they would spin the threads of fate, and it would be snipped off at the end of someone's life.
As someone who has listened to quite a bit of the band Amon Amarth, I'm familiar with the Norns as the title of The Fate of Norns,
Yeah.
which is a fantastic album. Um, I was wondering, on I guess the topic of women, I'm not too in tune with the paganism scene, especially in Europe. I don't live in Europe; I live in Canada, but I was wondering, since there's quite a few events held by pagans. There's conferences, but I've seen videos and clips from some other large like music events and get-togethers and rituals and things like that. I was wondering, what's the pagan nightlife like there? What's the scene like over there? And B, does this seem like it appeals to women? Because, like I said, you see kind of strands of this very popular with women. Every time I see a woman who's into crystals or is into new age stuff, it seems adjacent to this. And I was wondering if that's reflected in the scene.
To be honest, I can't give a definite answer for that. When I came to believe in the Germanic gods, it was something that was for me very private and personal, and I haven't really immersed myself in a wider um, sort of culture with it. There are those that I'll perform rituals with, and but at the same time, the sort of wider culture around it is something that I'm not really too familiar with. Mainly because a lot of the wider and more public pagan groups do tend to be, for want of a better word, a LARP. It does seem very in the recent years, especially when you've got the interest in it stemming from the popularity of things like the Vikings television program. A lot of people just get into it for the aesthetics. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of leftists in it who just use it to prop up sort of a new age culture around it as well. So it's very difficult to find a genuine hearth, a genuine group to perform blot and rituals with. So it becomes quite for a lot of pagans. It's a very it starts off as a very solitary experience until you find like-minded people to be able to share it with. But this is the way that it is when reviving a religion that's been um, abandoned for quite a long time. And even when Christianity started out, that also had a very similar um, approach that was practiced in people's houses in private before they could extend out to build a ecclesia or a church. So it was a very private and home-based experience before it could extend out. But There are some places in England. There's the Wodenist organisation as well over here, and I do believe that America seems to be the best place for it at the moment. In America, the Ermin Folk Society and also the what are they called? I forgot their name, but it's the one that Stephen McNallen is was formerly the head of, and they've now built three Hoffs, which is Odin's Hoff, Freya's Hoff, and I believe the other one is Thor's Hoff. So they've got three different heathen temples that have been built. I think two of them have been former churches that have been reconverted and reappropriated. But this shows that a community can build once it extends out of the home and becomes a lot more of a shared public experience. And it'll take time to extend from the private to the public, but um, again, this seems to follow a lot of similar behaviour among nationalists. For a lot of us, it's a very personal and private thing that we can't really share with many friends because they don't share that same outlook or same view. So it ends up not being able to be extrapolated into a wider communal context.
Well, that's interesting. You say that, and before we go on, I believe you're talking of Stephen McNallen, and I believe his group was the Astaru Folk
True Folk
Assembly,
Society,
otherwise known as the
yes, the one.
yeah. So yeah, that's so people can look that up as well. And also, I want to say I really do feel for our Viking friends because I remember a lot of what people see about people who are into Norse stuff and Viking stuff. Like I saw a bunch of guys on TikTok. One stands out. He's like this short, fat guy dressed like a Viking doing the LARP, and all he does is talk about how LGBT friendly the Vikings were, and I'm just like, that doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem like a thing that
No,
happened. But like pretty much every public facing version of this.
they literally have a word which is arger or rager, which is cognate with English eerie, where eerie originally meant timid or afraid. But this word arger um, means cowardly, unmanly, and it basically accuses people of being a homosexual. And insulting someone with this word would be a basis for having free range to murder them in response. And I know that Tacitus also mentioned that those who were deemed sodomites and perverts, they would be killed by being drowned in a bog to prevent their body from being publicly seen. It seemed that they had two main ways of execution. One would be to hang them on the gallows, often as a sacrifice to Woden, and that would be to publicly display criminals out in the open. Whereas those who were perverts and sodomites would be drowned in a bog because it was more important to hide their public shame.
That's good to know. I'm going to let the next gay Viking I see know that. Before I get too far away from this, you had mentioned before about seeking out people to do rituals with, and I don't know the nature of how sort of intimate this stuff is, but I was wondering if you could or you're willing. Could you kind of walk us through an example of a ritual one might do?
It is a very intimate thing, but it generally involves, like in short, it would involve creating the right ritual context first, whether that involves incense or candles, because that does seem to be a necessary thing for creating the right ritual context. But more importantly, um, ritual cleansing, being able to be pure before the gods, um, and it would involve a invocation and prayer to the gods, and giving them a offering. And while in times in the past, offerings would have involved some form of sacrifice. A sacrifice can be anything that you are willing to spare that you no longer need, or that you can give up and are able to part with. And in this case, it could be a offering of something like mead, something that was sacred to Woden. It could be various foods, and leaving that out as a offering to the gods, because you don't get any sort of any help from the gods for free. It's almost like a sort of almost like a kind of bartering relationship, in something that you offer them allows them to return their blessings and their help back to you. So in general, it involves an invocation and a prayer to the gods within a very closed, sacred setting. It has to be ritually closed off from the more profane outside world, and giving a offering to the gods. That's the like a general framework that I'd explain it. But obviously, it's a lot more private, a lot more intimate in that way.
That's really interesting stuff. I know it's a big question to ask. It's from someone who doesn't really know much about this, but I would understand that you wouldn't want to give a WikiHow article on what to do. But one thing I was, and actually, you know what? Now that I don't want to get off on a whole other thing here, but there's a movie that you might find interesting if you haven't seen it. It kind of seems to merge these two worlds, and it's a British movie as well. Have you heard of a movie called A Dark Song?
I haven't. No. When did that come out?
This would have been 2016. Now it's a story of a woman, a young woman, I believe. I'm trying to spoil anything. She loses her husband, and then she wants to essentially contact a guardian angel. So it's got sort of a Christian overtone, but she gets this guy who's kind of this alcoholic, gruff guy. They go to this house, and they basically, over the course of like a month or two, have to do a series of rituals and incantations. And he's going through all this old literature, and they like draw a circle of salt around the house because they're essentially cutting it off from the world. And the whole idea is to get an audience with this otherworldly being. Every single day they have to do all these rituals, like waterboarding, essentially letting blood and carving things on the floor. And then they get deeper and deeper essentially into hell, and they have these sort of entities. Anyway, British movie, 2016, A Dark Song. It seems to play around with a lot of these imageries all in one thing, and I think you might get a kick out of it, and maybe others who have an interest in this stuff.
That does sound quite interesting. It sounds like it's sort of, but it's within the general um, Hollywood Satanism approach to things. But yeah,
Well,
that does
he's
sound
he's
quite
seen as like
interesting.
an occult guy too. Yeah,
Yeah,
and also it takes it seriously, and it doesn't have a lot of really, it's not like full of Catholic imagery or anything. It seems to go into deep lore where even the Christian stuff, it's more like ancient English weird stuff. And I think that's kind of the purpose. He's not a Christian guy. He's very cynical, and he's very burned out, and he's not really even a believer. He's like a practical hired gun. I thought that was like just kind of a fun angle to take. I've seen this movie a couple times, but anyway, not to.
so is it more like a sort of folk horror sort of film?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I would describe it as. I'm trying to think of other movies. It would be like maybe it's like a lower budget. It's only a couple people in it, but I just think it's a slow burn, very moody. That's what I'm a guy who likes watching those A24 movies. So it's one of those
Yeah,
movies to appeal to guys like me.
yeah, I'll check it out. I do like a lot of good films, so yeah, I'll definitely check that out. Thank you.
And also, I find British horror movies specifically, they do a very good job of getting into folklore. There's this other movie I really liked called The Ritual. It's about a skinwalker, though, but kind of gets into that area as well.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
There's one called The Kill List. Like British horror does not get enough credit. Yeah.
There was quite a few newer ones coming out, but a lot of the 1970s folk horror, like The Wicker Man, like The Stone Tapes, um, and Blood on Satan's Claw. They all have this very sort of. It still captures this very curious otherworldliness that you get in rural Britain.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that in Canada too, I think, just because there's a very close relationship with the woods, with the forests, and that has a very distinct character. But I don't think there's as much folklore in Canada because it's a relatively new country. You get some stuff with the old, like the Aboriginal tribes and stuff, and that's where skinwalkers a lot of times come from. But
Yeah,
really, there's nothing with Britain. It feels like there's centuries and centuries of stuff to pull on, you know.
but isn't there quite a lot of the sort of the Wendigo lore in Canada?
There's Wendigos, there's Sasquatches. It's cryptids is what they like to call them. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of stories about creatures. And I'd always joke that one of the reasons we can be convinced that they're not real is because no one here's killed them yet. Because Canada, like America, has a lot of guns, and we love guns, and we love just finding stuff and shooting it. So that's why I always thought the Sasquatch might not be real because like it's not shot. There's right now, I'm sure there's 25,000 people trying to hunt down the Sasquatch.
well, if no one's found a Sasquatch corpse yet, then it's still out there.
Exactly. Well, this is where you also get into a lot of really trippy conspiracy stuff because that's where you get into David Paulides, where he talks about it. There's not one Sasquatch; there's a whole tribes of them, but they can also teleport and read your mind, and it gets really science fictiony the more you get into it.
What's quite interesting is attempts to try to rationalise cryptids. Like after the few hundred years of one of the most famous cryptids we have in Britain, which is the Loch Ness monster, there was the theory that it was actually a leftover plesiosaur that had survived the eradication of dinosaurs and had somehow nested itself in a small underground cave, even though the entire loch has been mapped and surveyed, and there are no underground caves in there. But theoretically, Atlantis monster is a leftover plesiosaur. Though, in order to survive this long, it'd have to have a much more a bigger population, but have to have enough males to females to reproduce and continue. So they had to. If this is the last lone survivor, you'd find remains of previous other plesiosaurs in there. But when it comes to the cryptids in America and Canada, it's quite interesting to consider how they would have branched off biologically. And say, well, is Bigfoot or Sasquatch related to the same ape family as humans? Could you dissect a Wendigo on a autopsy table?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the Bigfoot and the Sasquatch myths seem to be the most plausible. So, like, if someone's telling me, "Oh, there's some branch from some great ape that found its way into North America," I'd say, "Yeah, yeah, okay, I can." As far as cryptids go, that would be the most believable. Or even there was this mythological
Yeah,
creature.
it's more plausible.
Yeah, there's this mythological creature way up north. There's this show called The Terror that's very good, and it's about sort of an Inuit myth about this great big bear with a person's face. It's some kind of strange type of bear or flat faced bear, and they're talking has all these paranormal properties. But also, I'm like I could see that as just a type of bear that is rare and lurking around. So that stuff I get, but it's when I guess it's when you get into like ghosts and stuff. But if I would not be that shocked if most of these were out there somewhere.
Exactly. That seems to make them a lot more believable, a lot more plausible, and gives a good basis for them being out there.
Yeah, and also with the Loch Ness monster, you brought that up because as a kid, that one always fascinated me because as you're a kid, you like dinosaurs. But even as a kid, knowing nothing about any of this, it did seem strange that there's just one, and then wouldn't. So is that one 10,000 years old? What's the story? Or it'd have to be older than that. It'd have to be like a million years old. Or because then if it's not that one, then like you said, there must be many, many more and evidence of it. And what are they all eating? Because the loch doesn't have as much fish to support that. Little things like that, even to a child, stood out.
Yeah, it'd need a whole breeding population, and it'd need a good flora and fauna, and it'd certainly affect the its environment enough to leave more of an impact than just the visible sightings of it.
I bet that that's the Loch Ness monster fandom never really took off for that reason. Unlike Sasquatch, there's people who are crazy about Sasquatches. Loch Ness monster, not so much. It just never got people juiced up.
But it was quite juicy a few hundred years ago, or at least, especially in the Victorian period. Well, which is it seems very weird now saying things in the 20th century. I'm too used to saying things last century as if it. Even though I've spent more of my life in the 21st century than I have in the 20th, it still seems very strange saying things 2 centuries ago rather than just one. But in the 19th century, there was many attempts to try to prove a Loch Ness monster, and it was very popular. And unfortunately, a lot of the hoaxes seem to kill off any possibility of it then, including many true believers who were deeply invested in trying to prove that it existed. And eventually, even those true believers ended up creating forgeries and hoaxes just to validate themselves.
That's such a strange thing to think of. I guess you still see that now to some respect of people just hitching their entire livelihood and their career to this thing being real.
Yeah,
But I do love the idea of someone just like, this is my thing. I'm going to be a Loch Ness monster guy. I need this.
yeah,
This will be a strange question. And when I ask these questions, it's not me trying to kick up dirt or cause any problems, but the question would be, would there be any types of paganism that you might be unfriendly to or would think would be inferior? Now, the reason I ask that is because as we were talking, we talked about examples in Egypt, examples in the Aztecs, perhaps all throughout Africa as well. And we had done some reading recently on a book by George Bataille called The Accursed Share, and it goes pretty deep into pre-Christian history, specifically the Aztecs, but also Tibetan monks and things like that. But I think it spent a lot of time on Aztecs and in the very specific way they did sacrifices, especially human sacrifices. And I just wanted to ask, within the paganism sphere that you've seen, are there any historic examples of paganism that would seem a bit too far, maybe this is the bad word, but too savage or bad? Or do you think it's all good?
yeah, of course. I'd definitely see a lot of the Aztec and a lot of African ones as being far too savage. As I said before, there's a deeply biopolitical aspect to paganism because of its much more natural basis. When one worships the gods, there's something that they what they get from it is a very um, when people invoke the gods, it's for things of blessing the land, of blessing their own fertility, their own prowess in warfare, and things like that. There's a lot more of a very biological basis for what people expect the gods to give them and how the gods interact with the world. It's something that it has seemed very strange to invoke the gods to help increase the interest in your bank account, or help them to build a skyscraper. There's like nothing sort of natural and organic about that. It's something that the way that the gods interact with the world is a very in a very natural way, and like how they influence it, how they influence fate, how they shape the world around us. And quite interesting is a point that was raised in going back to the point of films earlier, Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, and that was a very interesting take on the South American rainforest, well, the South American culture and the Aztecs prior to the colonization by the Spanish. And what's quite interesting is that them resorting to mass human sacrifice was a result of their already declining society. And that sort of, it's interesting to see that there's the decline of their society, both morally, but also their whole social structure, seeing it collapse. Their agricultural approach was quite primitive, and it's no wonder that they resorted to the things that they did in order to try to get the results from the gods that they wanted. And like I won't deny that even the Northern Europeans practiced sacrifice, including human sacrifice that was recorded by Adam of Bremen, um, about what was done by the priest of the temple of Uppsala in Sweden. But on the one hand, I could denounce it and go, no, we don't do that anymore. I denounce human sacrifice. But at the same time, I'm going to say things like that are a product of history, not of its beliefs. At the same time, sacrifice is always necessary to honor the gods, but the extent of it and at the extent that people go to in such extreme ways of mass human sacrifice um, doesn't reflect on the validity of the religion or on the action of the gods. It could just as easily have its roots in the failing of that society as well.
And I will just say for the record, we are not necessarily an anti human sacrifice podcast. All I'm going to say is that when we read The Accursed Share, he made a very solid case for human sacrifice. And George Bataille was he's pretty left leaning. I'd argue he was a Marxist guy, but he was also very into the occult. So he would probably be more on the Satanism side of things. However, we're not here to judge either. So all I'm saying is I'm open to hearing arguments for human sacrifice.
I've only read Bataille's Story of the Eye. I haven't read the book that you just mentioned, but I'll be willing to give it a read and see what his justifications are. But I think the associations
I'll
he
give you the
had with.
brief rundown if you want to.
Yeah, okay.
All right, I'll just give you a quick thing because he's a pretty modern guy. So when he's talking about history, sometimes it seems like he might play fast and loose with the facts. But in short, this is kind of an economic model, and you can see how it ties into Marxist thinking. And we're not like a Marxist podcast, but we've read a lot of their stuff to kind of get an understanding of what they say and they think. But it starts off with something that's kind of interesting. His idea, first, for people who are unfamiliar, Marx, when he wrote Capital, a lot of Volume 1 was about this thing called the surplus. And the way he discussed it, that when you're in some kind of productive mode of production, you have this thing called the surplus. And then the capitalist only exists to take that surplus and then create more surplus for the sake of it. And so surplus kind of becomes its own self-fulfilling entity that only exists to maximize itself. And so Marx and a lot of the Marxists were like, well, to make something for the sake of surplus is bad. That's whatever. We should get rid of it. But Bataille was saying that the idea of creating surplus is inevitable. And he took the angle of natural systems, where he says, look, everything creates more energy than it needs to survive. That's what every organism does. Every organism produces a surplus, but it uses it for growth. That's how a human grows. That's how animals feed. And then it gets enough energy to reproduce itself. And then if you look in any system, it always produces more than it needs. And he said, okay, so we can't view surplus as this invention of capitalism. It's something that's going to happen no matter what. And now he says, well, what do we do with it? Because his theory, and this is where the Marxist stuff comes in, he says, if you just create too much surplus for the sake of it, you end up suffocating yourself. Your society becomes decadent. It becomes rotting from the inside, which is, he would look around the modern world and see that. So he looked in history, and he looked at some Aboriginal tribes. He looked at the Aztecs. He looked at Tibetan monks, a couple others, I think, but those are the main three. And he says they all produce a surplus, but what we did throughout history was we sacrificed it in a big public display. And that way it didn't destroy us. And this was an interesting case he was making, that this is the meaning of festivals. And he goes through tribal structures, monarchies, or the Aztec hierarchy, and says, really, this is what sacrifices were about. It was essentially burning off in a grand ritual to appeal to the gods, or in the case of a festival, you're distributing the surplus throughout the village or the town as a big feast. And they're like, okay, well, that makes sense. And then the Aztec example, I think, was the most interesting, because it was like, well, what the human sacrifice was usually a slave. And so that was it was a commodity. Their people were also commodities like anything else. And they said, and to be sacrificed, you almost have to elevate it. You don't sacrifice trash. You sacrifice something that is supremely valuable. So it was charting the course of, they would kind of take the slave, but he was almost king for a day before he was sacrificed. And he was seen as this great honor and this great thing. And you wouldn't, but then there's the Mexicans did it a bit differently. He compares the Aztecs to these other tribes where it was just, they would sacrifice prisoners of war, and their empires fell. Anyway, but it was a case to be made that it was something you have to burn off your surplus in a grand public way. Otherwise it rots you from within. And I thought, this was coming from a Marxist guy, and a guy who was arguably just a Satanist. This was a guy who was known to do midnight orgies with candles and skulls everywhere, very occult. But a lot of people like it. And I thought it was kind of cool. Anyway, what do you think of that, based on my kind of strange overview?
I think he gives a somewhat rational basis for it. He seems to understand why animal sacrifices were performed. He doesn't. I'm not fully convinced by his explanation for human sacrifice, but at the same time, I can see that it's comparable to other societies as well. In the early Germanic history, there's a interesting source for the Varangian Guard, and the Varangian Guard were Vikings who were traded over in Eastern Europe, and they formed the basis of Russia. In fact, the name of the Rus comes from the same as the English word rudder, and these are Scandinavian Rutherman, or rowers, forms the basis of the word Rus for Russia, and these Scandinavians who were trading and defending a lot of the Byzantine Empire in Eastern Europe were recorded by a Arab biographer called Ibn Fadlan. And in Ibn Fadlan's history, he describes a lot of these Rus Vikings, and they seem to be to perform a human sacrifice. And there's a woman who's being sacrificed, and she seems very willing, and she seems quite ecstatic in the state of her sacrifice. And as you said, it seems like a point of social elevation, so that those who are chosen to be the victim take on a new social role and feel that their human sacrifice is necessary for the continuity of the society that they're in. So yeah, I can see the rationale and reason for it, and why even those who were victims may see themselves as being willing victims for a greater good.
It is interesting too that outside of the ritual aspect of it, everyone implicitly understands the act of sacrificing your life for the community. That someone, if it weren't a ritual, but it was throwing yourself upon some threat to protect the community, people would understand that and see it as a heroic act. And also, on the other hand, the entire idea of a human sacrifice, even though I might not endorse it, I would understand it because I said, well, you would sacrifice something that is of the utmost importance. So, like use animals or any it, valuable commodity. And I'm like, what would be more valuable than a slave that you like or something like that?
Yeah, I can, I can certainly see the rationale and reason for it. And again, if you believe in your metaphysical worldview involving um, darker entities, rather than the sort of um, the strict dualistic structure that you get with Christianity, which has an absolute good and an absolute evil, where a lot of that absolute evil is sublimated entirely to Satan. A lot of the in a lot of the pagan worldviews, there is many different ranges and forms of evil, of dark entities, dark spirits that can affect and shape, and all these dark spirits are very much woven into that same like a spiritual tapestry of how fate exerts itself on us, whether it shapes those towards good ends or bad ends. So, if you believe that there are these darker and quite a demonic aspects that are influencing and shaping the world around you, if those are the causes of how you become sick, or why your cattle are dying, or something like that, then why wouldn't you engage in human sacrifice if you believed that that would be a strong enough thing um, to avert famine, or to avert your family dying, or something like that. If that sacrifice is able to shake off not a physical threat, because one could sacrifice themselves for a physical threat by um, jumping in the way of someone trying to shoot you, for example, or any form of physical harm. But if that sort of harm was spiritual, then you'd have to engage in something that could combat that.
I had a question, and again, this might sound like a very basic and also perhaps impossible to answer question, but on that topic of evil and how the Christian worldview would kind of group it into one thing called Satan, would you do you see any significant difference between how I guess Western Christianity and Western paganism would conceptualize evil itself?
Yeah, I do think that there are many, a lot of the way in how European Christianity understands many of its elements are filtered through a pagan worldview. Um, there's a very interesting book called The Germanization of Christianity, which outlines this in quite a lot of detail. But a lot of there's as much of a relationship that works in two ways, in not only the Christianization of paganism, but in the paganization of Christianity. And this sort of repaganization and the relationship in how the conversion happened means that a lot of European attitudes towards Christianity are seen through a very pagan lens, or they readopt and reappropriate a pagan perspective that fits within our natural folk soul. In fact, even the aspect of the Trinity, of where God can be three entities at once while still being singular, that seems to point to that of a very sort of European attitude towards pagan gods as being aspects of an underlying spiritual truth, of where you have multiple entities that are all part of something greater than itself without being reducible to it. And I think that's a very European attitude, and I think that's one of the reasons of why paganism, why Christianity has actually been so readily understood and accepted by Europeans, because some elements of it are pagan in origin and appeal to that same pagan mind. So I think the same would apply to evil.
I was going to say this is something we'd discussed before about how it seems that the distinct natures of Christianity, where Christianity seems to be express itself so uniquely in different European cultures, seems to tell me at least that Christianity was in fact welded on or draped over an existing infrastructure. Because you must ask yourself, why does it seem to express itself so differently across different European ethnicities? And then there was a interesting case, a claim made by this. Actually, there's two interesting things to that. One is that there's this book that I like that a lot of people have read called Albion's Seed, by what's his name, David Hackett, I believe, but I got it from Arctos. But it defines the founding of America through four traditional British folkways, and these would be the Protestants, these would be the Quakers, these would be the Appalachians and whatnot. But he was saying how they define a folkway can be broken down into something like, Christ, 20 different things. Like, how do you define a people? How do you define a folk? So it's like how they build their houses, how they wear their clothes, how they raise their kids. It goes through a big long list. Every single thing is distinct. And then one thing I noticed, and I brought this up before, but one thing I noticed was they had religion ways, which is, Christianity, but then they also had what he called magic ways. And these, it seemed obvious that even though these distinct British folkways had Christianity, they had this whole substrata of folk beliefs that they also carried with them that were very distinct from everyone else's. And you notice that even in Europeans now, where they might be Catholic, they might be Christian, but especially if you're in Eastern Europe, you got a whole subset of beliefs about ghosts and luck and these entities that are very real to you. And so it seemed that the entire time they were, and I think arguably to this day, but maybe less now, but there was always this synthesis going on between these pagan beliefs and Christianity. Does that sound in line with what you were saying?
Yeah. Well, even in a lot of early Middle Ages, their attitude to Christianity would have been completely alien to the modern post-Reformation age. They would have believed in ghosts. They would have held on to magical talismans. In fact, a lot of the Anglo-Saxon, there's a book called the um, Leechbach and Watercunnings, that refers to various medical cures, magical spells and charms, and whatnot. And it's quite an interesting source for various pagan leftovers in Anglo-Saxon, which has been Christian since they became literate. There's very little pagan elements in Anglo-Saxon literature, uh, although Beowulf contains a quite a archaic throwback to a pre-Christian world. It's still written by a Christian author and within a Christian worldview. So it seems to have this uh, a mixture of two different worlds. But yeah, in the magical charms, you find various things that involve um, burying a piece of turf and saying magical prayers, and some of those prayers would be a sort of a weird mixture of pagan elements and Christian elements, saying that you're a paternoster, and mixing a particular um, a mixture of various herbs and things together, and then laying that on the turf that you've buried under the ground, and that will help increase your crops and things like that. So you have this very sort of strange mixture of magic, of things that would be considered proto witchcraft in a way, of things that involve like a particular idols that Christians would have in their home of the Virgin Mary and things like that. You have these, even the whole thing of like the pantheon of saints acts as a sort of continuity of polytheism. So you have all these sort of all these various elements of where even within Christianity, Europeans just can't avoid their own nature. There's these particular um, folkish mindset that defines who we are and how we see the world. And no matter what religion we've converted to, we still see the world through that same lens. And it's definitely true that the European attitudes towards Christianity are completely different to what we'd find in Syria or in Ethiopia.
That's the example I always give, which is that, the Christianity as people know it now is very distinctly European. I don't think there's really two ways around that. I try to say that not necessarily. I don't like getting into big theological debates over this, but to me it seems obvious that and like the saints example was fantastic, and we always joked about it, where the importance of saints, especially to nations that are relatively new to Catholicism. Like, there's a reason that Irish people like their Irish saints, and they don't like saints from, or if they had a choice, they would pick their guy, the person that represents their fucking home team. There's a reason they give these
Yeah,
up. So I'm like, there's some kind of ethno thing going on in here that everyone's just kind of ignoring, right?
exactly. A lot of saints within Catholicism end up taking on the elements or specific roles or duties of their former gods. And it's no coincidence that that helps to reconnect them to the new faith by putting it into a context where the specific relationship they have to their native gods continues through the role of particular saints.
We're talking a lot about what you might call a synthesis between paganism and Christianity, which I think is evident in a variety of ways. It's not a one-to-one thing, but I think a lot of people have noted it. But I noticed that in our political sphere, at least right now at the tail end of 2022, there's a healthy debate going on between pagans and Christians, and even between pagans themselves. And there's a few pagans in our scene who you have mentioned, and then there's some others. I think Thultide would be one, and Survive the Jive is a pretty popular. He doesn't seem to engage in this stuff much, but I think the one, I guess to start with, I was wondering, in your opinion, do you see Christianity being able to live alongside paganism, or like some others, do you see paganism as something that needs to be stepped away from entirely, and then maybe there's no collaboration possible?
I think there's a problem when, because of the exclusivity of Christianity, which by its own nature can only be true if everything else is false. That tends to be a problem because of that. Um, it it would, by its own nature, rule out paganism and make it impossible. It would declare it as being demonic, would be see it as devil worship, false idols, and things like that. And until that obstacle is stepped over, until Christians are able to go, well, I may not believe in your gods, but they're not demons. They aren't going to cause the moral decline of the European people. Then this sort of a relationship and a much more sort of a cooperative relationship can happen. But I think one of the other problems besides this exclusivity, which tends to pop up from time to time, especially when you get people who are just generally hostile to paganism because they see it as something which would undermine their own religion. But I think the another problem um, is the issue of ethnic identity and um, um, our sense of self comes from who we are as the European people, where we come from, and there's a very strange obstacle when it comes to dealing with things like the Jewish question, for example, and because of the Jewish roots within Christianity, it does make it difficult for them to make sense of those two different elements. So you get things like Christian identity, where they'll rewrite history and say we were the real Jews, we were the real Israelites, they're actually Khazars and things like that, and it seems to detract from being able to fully embrace who we are as a people and being proud of who we are as a people. And if we're constantly trying to rewrite history and say that we were actually someone else, or to insult our own ancestors and say, "Oh, well, until they converted, we were a horrible people. We believed in false idols. We worshipped devils. But then, thankfully, Christianity came along to save us from ourselves." And I see that as a deep problem for nationalism. The whole idea that we need to be saved from ourselves is the very thing that we get professed at by leftists, who constantly tell us that because of the guilt of white privilege, we need to be saved from ourselves, and we only have value, we only have worth once we rid ourselves of our whiteness. And I see these two different areas as being parallel to each other. That until we can fully embrace ourselves and not reject ourselves as being idol worshippers, demon worshippers, and whatnot. And this is where the exclusivity issue comes back into it. Until we can be fully proud of ourselves, there's it seems to be an obstacle for white unity and being able to build any proper basis for nationalism, because we'll just constantly be undermining the very basis of ourselves.
That's a very interesting take on it, because that was one question I was going to ask you. Because my understanding, and maybe the historical understanding of paganism, would be it was pretty exclusive, as we discussed, to the area or to the people, very folk centric, region centric. However, I think we are seeing a birth of this sort of what might we call it, like sort of a pan-European pagan, at least awareness. And I was wondering, from your point of view, do you see sort of cross-pagan unity, like between the Scandinavians and then, let's say, the British and then also the Germans, or do you see them all as kind of joined up, or are they distinct and that there's new opportunities for collaboration? What do you think?
I think there's a sort of a relationship of unified yet recognizing our differences, and it's exactly the same way as we see nationalism. In fact, I see a lot of the attitude we have towards paganism to be almost identical to how we see paganism in the same way. That sort of sharing a common origin, sharing a common bond, but also the importance of being able to respect our differences and cultures rather than being blended into one unified mass. So I think that both the question of pagan unity is identical to the question of national unity and racial unity.
That's fascinating. I think at the center of these debates that I've seen, I haven't really participated in them, there seemed to be a grander or more crucial debate between universalism and what we might call particularism. Have you seen that? Have you been engaged in that? Because that to me seemed to be the whole Christian versus pagan thing, right?
Yeah, and this is because of the general race blindedness of Christianity, which can see the idea that it's more important to praise someone because they're a Christian rather than someone who's part of your own racial kindred. And the general globalization and universalization that Christianity has had in spreading itself over the world, it's tended to rob those or rob people of their distinct national character. However, I'd also step into this sort of blanket criticism by saying, of course, Christianity does develop into um, unique flavors of different people. As I said earlier, there's something very distinct about European types of Christianity compared to what you'd expect in Africa or the Middle East. But at the same time, there's a particular um, there's something like a form of proto-globalism um, in how Christianity spreads because it seems to because it sees itself as rooted in real-time history and sees itself as being the absolute single truth. As a result, it can't leave things alone because other things being left alone would make them. It's like admitting that you can allow heresy, you can allow the this false worship of demons and things like that, as far as their worldview would allow in that sense. So I think that there needs to be some sort of a reparticularism uh, or a new understanding of particularism within Christianity, which I think can only happen within right wing circles. I think that the much more liberal and left wing Christianity very is quite universal and pretty much it took all those elements all to heart, and that's pretty much um, undermined any particularism within different peoples. But I think that this sort of balance between the particularism of national and racial differences is something that can cause a bit of an obstacle for Christianity, but it needs to find a rationale around it to make those two things coexist. It needs to be uh, because it is quite a universal religion because it's something that considers itself true for all people across all time. But at the same time, it needs to work itself into a particularist world where different races exist in the world. It can't just merge everything together under its religious umbrella. So it needs to find that balance between the particular and the universal. And I think this will also be part of that same peaceful cooperation between both pagans and Christians who can um, who can work on behalf of their own particular racial and cultural interests without it all being sublimated under a universalist banner.
That's a very interesting take on because I see this happening a lot, and I don't know how. I don't think it's a debate that could ever be resolved because each side will deny that the claims of the other. But I, I, I I'm optimistic that there can be more collaboration. And I know there's a lot of people on the Christian side who are tired of arguing about it and just want to move forward. So I hope maybe 2023 will be the year we can all chart a path forward. Um, And I've got one last thing I wanted to talk about, which is somewhat related to this. And it's something I found very, very fascinating over the past little while on your channel and a few others, but yours specifically. And it connects directly to something that I've been writing of recently. I've got an article I've been working on a site that's not even live yet, but I'm working on it. It's about, in short, it's discussing this concept we call liberalism, this ideology called liberalism, in a way that it can almost be redeemed. And what I mean by that for people, this is something we've kind of talked about before. It's I know Mike from Imperium Press, to give an example. He's big on this about how we must be anti-liberal. We must remove liberalism. We must turn the clocks back on liberalism, and work towards a more traditionalist, more further back pagan ancient way of living. Whereas some others, such as yourself, I know Thule Tide is big on this, and a great many others who are saying that, well, if you break down what liberalism actually is, we can say, of course, it's been corrupted. Of course, it is an engine of everything we don't like. However, if its roots are into something deeper, into something more essential within broadly the European mind, about this idea of individualism need not necessarily lead to atomization, but the idea of you being a sovereign entity within the larger structure is something that might be unique to Europeans that maybe we can't even get rid of. And that, the what is the scientific revolution except, trying to have an aggressive relationship with the unknown? Can we even dream of getting rid of that? Like, how much must we unwork the European state of being to even accomplish that? And sorry, this is a bit of a ramble, but I wanted to set the stage for people because I thought you had a very interesting take about, and if you want to just go back and forth about this, but about how, the uniqueness of European individuality versus this kind of vague collectivism people seem to want to get to. What do you think about all that?
Well, yeah. With the debate, it seemed that while Mike was dismissing liberalism, his rationale for doing so was it seemed to be informed by a very liberal basis, which was quite ironic. Um, he'd say that liberalism is the smallpox blanket that we've delivered to the rest of the world. So we've essentially infected other people, other races, and tried to force them into a liberal way of life. And it's the same corrosive power that is affecting us as much as it affects them. And but I think that caring for other races and caring about their well-being and our impact on them is a very liberal mindset. The idea that we want to live in a world of pluralism where other races can exist in their part of the world as we do in ours. The very sort of focused pluralist vision of the world, which is something that I share myself. Um, it's something that does seem to have quite a liberal basis. Other races would take over our countries and raise us to the ground. They wouldn't want to spare us. They wouldn't hang our accomplishments, our art, in our museums as a way of showcasing the wonderful diversity of the world. They just want to destroy us and blot out our memory entirely. So the idea that we should have a stake or care about other races and how liberalism is impacting them is ironically a very liberal perspective. But Philtide's attitude seemed to be that of liberalism being it's the kind of best of a greater evil. And when liberalism includes things like rule of law, includes meritocracy, includes altruism towards other people, and things like that. These are liberal values, but they aren't something that can be reduced merely to the ideology of liberalism. There's something that we can see elsewhere in across time when the Romans um, who were also obviously ethically European. Um, Under their Pax Romana, the idea that you could conquer a country, they would pay you tribute in what their agricultural produce was, and you'd allow them to carry on their traditions, their culture, and way of life. But they'd be under the Roman law, but also the Roman peace. You'd conquer their country, but protect them from any outsider harm. Um, that allowing people to carry on their traditions and way of life is a very liberal worldview. It may be a very ancient form of liberalism, and one might even argue that even National Socialism, its view on the Herrenvolk, that a nation is to be the master of its own house, that admits of the same kind of pluralism, the nationalist worldview of independent sovereign nations, rather than all being ruled under a single empire. That sort of view in which we can kind of um, mind our own space as long as no one takes over our space. That is a very liberal worldview. The coexistence of different nations and cultures that forms that nationalist ideal is quite liberal in its basis. And I think that a lot of the arguments between Imperium Press, well, Mike of Imperium Press and Thultide, seem to be arguing over this as being an issue of ideology. And I referred it. I was having a discussion with people like American Krogan, Nick Stilvey, and others about this issue. And it was Krogan who posted about it first, but then I decided to flesh out the discussions we were having in further detail. And that came to the point that it seems to have a basis in our a kind of a disposition or psychology, which is what Kevin MacDonald has argued in his book, which is Individualism and the Western Liberal Tradition. And this seems to view this kind of behaviour of how we interact with other people, our how we form societies, especially in the sort of cold and frozen environments that Northern Europeans have grown up in. There's a kind of psychological basis which can manifest itself in ideas like liberalism, but this kind of disposition is part of our innate biological mindset. It's how we see the world. It's how we form relationships with people. Um, and this sort of behaviour includes things like marrying widows and taking on their children, or having or adopting children. And this is something that other societies wouldn't, or other races wouldn't do. But yet, it seems something that's quite unique about the general altruism with the European people. And I do think that this tends to recall how we um, a part of our genetic selection. With K selection types, this involves those who would have fewer children, but they'd be cared for a lot more deeply and given a much more rich and loving family. Whereas the attitude we'd see in races like blacks, for example, is R selection, where they'd produce endless amounts of children, but just leave them and not care for them. Of course, there's the whole meme around single black families, but this is a result of that whole K selection versus R selection. And this sort of attitude reflects a very racially distinct attitude in how we create and bond with people. And that seems to suggest that not all collectivisms are the same. And this sort of attitude has pretty much led to things like the Nazbol attitude, of where you'd find people claiming that if only we'd imitate China, all our problems would be resolved. If only we had based authoritarian state, it would fix all our problems. And We can't just imitate the collective behaviour of other races. We can't just imitate how the Chinese behave. We can't just imitate how Africans or Arabs behave. There's something very unique about the biological makeup, how we form societies, how we form relationships with people, that is inherent to who we are. And this is what informs liberalism. It's something that we can't get rid of, because it's not just an ideology, it's part of who we are and what we are. And it's all too easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater by trying to get rid of liberalism. But in turn, that seems to undermine who we are and what we are.
I agree completely. And when people will say, I know some people will say, oh, we need to get rid of liberalism just as a thing to say. But really, once you break it down, you say, well, how can we even do that? And there's two examples that are pretty interesting. One that's directly relatable to the discussion of paganism that we're on, but it's this great book that I'm sure a lot of people have read. We've talked about it many times before, but it's The Ancient City by
Yeah,
Fustel
yeah.
de Collage, and it outlines sort of like the bloodline worship and the hearth and the household and everything, and it makes a strong case going far back to pre-Christian Rome, how this idea of private property was essential. Well, why was it private property? Well, because that was the home and hearth of your ancestors. And so, quite literally, your ancestors were buried there. You bled for that. You would fight for it, and you might be called upon to fight for it. But you had, and even in Britain, you had the yeoman, the freeman, the warrior farmer who was literally got a hoe in one hand and a gun in the other, because he had to be both at the same time. But within that, you see this a lionization of private property, which might sound like an American thing right now, but no, like it has deep roots. So to be anti private property, you would need to unwind that to something pre Rome. But I really do think the psychological desire to have this place that you believe that you own, you cannot get rid of that. And what's interesting is, even if you read the Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi, when he's kind of proposing this arguably third positionist anti-capitalist government, even he would say, look, the fundamental unit of society is the family, it is the household, and we're not really going to talk about, what people do within their house. It's important. It was understood that it's important for a family to have some land that they can fight for and raise their kids on. And so you can't get rid of that. And also, a book we covered recently was The Crisis of the European Mind by Paul Hazard. I bring up a lot, and that was a very specific case, but a very short amount of time, sort of post enlightenment, or just maybe just pre enlightenment, but post scientific revolution. And it was showing how after the scientific revolution, and like, what was the scientific revolution? Well, that was just Europeans doing this thing they do where they want to take things apart and see how they work. There was nothing scientism about it. There was nothing that we would know as science now about it, but it was like, let's figure out what gravity is, shit like that. It was very apolitical. And then it shows how it becomes political over the course of like 30 years. You have the emergence of this thing called critique, and this isn't critique like the Kevin McDonald Jewish culture critique, but it's similar. This idea of rationality and criticism as an aggressive force, as a way to attack the traditional. Before, there was no issue with rationalism and the scientific desire living alongside both paganism and arguably even Christianity. But then it was almost like an intellectual revolution, which, in my opinion, gave birth to liberalism as we know it now, which is just this motive critique to attack all forms of traditionalism as we know it. And it didn't happen that long ago, and it didn't take that. It was a new fucking thing is kind of what I was getting at. But you can see how even the roots of liberalism, there was a period where liberalism, most of it was just swimming alongside everything else. And it was just these fucking shitty academics that started publishing weird books. Anyway, that was a bit of a ramble, but what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, a lot of the Enlightenment period tried to revive a lot of um, a lot of Greek and Roman thought, and then tried to flesh that out a bit more. And anyone who's saying that the ideas of the Enlightenment period um, represent liberalism would have to apply that same rationale to the roots of those things in ancient Greece and Rome. So you could say, is Plato a liberal? Is Aristotle a liberal? Um, so a lot of these ideas have that same basis, in which case you have to point to a specific point in time as to um, when exactly it emerged. And I think you made a very good point for how it developed in that particular time period through the development of critique, because it's not just using things like science to describe the world and understand how it works. It's trying to use it to create an ideology that can not only understand it, but use that to reshape and remold the world. And I think it's that sort of attitude in which that kind of dominance that one has over nature, when you can not only understand how it works, but try to redefine what it is something that does form a very negative basis for how we got to where we are now.
That's a very fascinating point. Now, I do need to get going right about now, and that was pretty much all I wanted to discuss. And you answered everything, all of my questions amazingly well. And I was wondering if before we end, was there anything that you wanted to discuss that I didn't get a chance to bring up?
No, I think a lot of the points we've made have connected very well. They've tied together very well. So I'm very happy with how it went. Thank you.
Fantastic. And before we go, I want to make sure. So you'd mentioned you had a Substack. I've never read your Substack. Is it up? And where can people find it?
Oh, it's up. It doesn't have any published articles yet, but it should be, I guess, hwitgeard.substack.com or something like that. Either way, it's the same name of I use on here and on Telegram and on Odyssey as well, which is HWIT Hwit and Yard GEARD.
Perfect. I just got it in front of me right now. I'd never seen a link. So this is very good. I look forward to reading whatever you publish on there. And also, everyone, be sure to check out his Telegram channel, just like he spelled it right there. I believe I see your original one. You had a few that were banned, but it looks like you're back to just a regular one, right?
Yeah, well, the previous ones I had in Old Norse, so it was Hvitgarður, which is Old Norse for White Garth or White Yard. And then after two accounts got banned, I decided to change to Old English. So it's the third time lucky so far.
This is everyone check that out because I'm looking at it right now. I mean, there's a lot of really great posts on it. They go very, very deep into all the history and all the stuff. I can't recommend it enough. And if people have an interest in this stuff, leave us a comment or anything like that. We mentioned a couple other people on the show that are also similarly interesting. I'm not very knowledgeable about this stuff, but I'm always looking for more information. And I just want to thank you very much for taking the time to come up. I know time zone differences are difficult, but thank you for showing it. I thought it was a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Jim, bye.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.